Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and it's my privilege and my pleasure to be joined by two notable authors for this broadcast. First of all, Stephen Singular, the author of Legacy of Deception, published in softcover by Dove Books, and also Stephen Worth, who, along with Carl Jaspers, co-authored the book Blood Oath, once again published in softcover, copyright 1996 by Rainbow Books. Gentlemen, welcome to our airwaves.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, both Stevens have written books concerning the OJ Simpson case, and you have both come up with information which dovetails to a certain extent, and there are also some differences. One of the similarities is that both of your books basically present a picture of the OJ Simpson case that is very different from the, shall we say, Geraldo viewpoint that we've been getting, and both of your books had their genesis, I guess one could say, with the information given by an anonymous informant. Now, Stephen Singular, first of all, you were contacted by an anonymous informant within the Los Angeles legal system who specifically contacted you because of your previous work on a book called Talk to Death. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, in 1984, a talk show host in Denver named Alan Berg, who was Jewish, was assassinated by a group that turned out to be a group of neo-Nazis from the northwest of the United States. Berg was rather controversial and outspoken, etc., and this group had a plan to essentially overthrow the United States. There were 9 men, so this was a rather grandiose plan, and eliminate our country of blacks, Jews, Hispanics, homosexuals, and other people that they deemed undesirable. Berg was their first real target. They had plans for people like Henry Kissinger and others, but they started with Alan Berg, and they did, in fact, come to Denver and assassinate him on June 18th of 1984. They were subsequently arrested, tried, convicted, and their leader was killed in a shootout with the FBI, but the rest of them are in federal penitentiaries around the country. So I became involved in 1984 in doing research on that particular event and those events, and wrote a book called Talk to Death, The Life and Murder of Alan Berg, which was published in 1987. And I did quite a bit of research into neo-Nazi groups, white supremacists, people of that ilk, and maintained a series of contacts within the legal system over the next decade, basically.
Stephen, your book was subsequently was the basis for the movie Talk Radio by
Correct.
Oliver Stone.
Oliver Stone's movie that came out in early 1989, which was a bit of it used some of what my book directly and had some other things thrown in. I watched the famous OJ Simpson Bronco ride on June 17th, 1994. It obviously made him look rather guilty. Had some strong feelings about the case, but didn't have any particular connection to it in any way until early August of 1994. Now a decade has passed since Berg's assassination. Got a call from someone in the Southern California legal system whom I had known for about a decade, going back to the Berg Project, who said there's a lot more to this case than meets the eye, and gave me 4 pieces of specific evidence. Some of them were physical pieces of evidence, some were other connected things, and said, I really think you should try to do something with this, and maybe you can uncover more of what happened. I didn't quite understand what was going on. I mean, it seemed rather far-fetched and disconnected from anything I was doing in Denver. I was sitting in Denver watching this on television, but the information was so compelling that if true, I just felt something had to be done with it. So I said, well, you mean you want me to contact the prosecution? And the source said, no, go to the defense. Prosecution's never going to listen to you. Other people have come forward. They've been rebuffed. You're never going to get anywhere that way, and it's just not going to work. So go to the defense. And as I outline in the book, basically I did contact the defense, and 4 days later I was sitting in Los Angeles in Robert Shapiro's office meeting with their lead private investigator, Bill Pavlik, and their third or fourth lawyer in command, Carl Douglas, who was Johnny Cochran's right-hand man there. So for 3 months I had a relationship mostly with Carl Douglas, and did convey a lot of information to them. Some of it surfaced at the trial, some of it still has not really surfaced. And in time was to learn that basically I was contacted because Mark Furman was associated with some of the people that I had written about in the Berg book, so it kind of came full circle. It took me a few months to sort of put all this together, but in fact, what tipped us off was that my wife was watching television one morning in February, about 6 months later, and said, "Gee, do you know that Mark Furman's living up in Sandpoint, Idaho?" Sandpoint, Idaho is where roughly Sandpoint, Idaho is where the murder weapon was confiscated by the FBI, the weapon that killed Alan Berg, in this sort of Nazi, this little room with Nazi paraphernalia all over it. And so the bells sort of started to ring at that point, and I thought, my God, that maybe all this does fit together somehow. And, of course, Furman lives up there now. So, anyway, it all does connect in one form or another, and there's still a lot of work to be done in the Simpson case. But that's a kind of an overview of my involvement.
We're going to get to some of the discrepancies in the physical evidence that you discuss, and also some of the discrepancies discussed by Stephen Worth. And later on, and perhaps later on in the week, we will be joined by Donald Freed, who, of course, has written a book called Killing Time, indicating some of the problems with the official timeline. Now, with regard to Mark Furman, Stephen Singular, there were allegations presented in a Newsweek article, these coming, according to Newsweek, from sources who had confided to an LAPD investigation of Mark Furman, that he was allegedly the head or involved with a white supremacist group within LAPD called WASP. I've never heard any confirmation of these charges. And now, your source contacted you saying, as he is quoted in the book in your book Legacy of Deception, that neo-Nazis are not just on the fringes of society anymore, but they're within the system and doing a lot of damage. Of course, Mark Furman did retire to the area where there's been a lot of neo-Nazi and Aryan Nations activity, and the Order, the group you wrote about in Talk to Death, had some of their operations based in that area. Has there been any hard confirmation of links between Mark Furman and white supremacist groups, or was this all still a matter of, to a certain extent, conjecture and circumstantial evidence?
I think, at least as far as I know, and my book sort of ends at that point, Stephen Worth may be able to talk about this better than I can, that it was more or less circumstantial evidence and conjecture, except for the fact that if you took almost direct quotes out of my book, Talk to Death, some of the things that the neo-Nazis in there said, some of the things that appeared in the infamous Turner Diaries, which was a big part of that book. The group that killed Berg, their blueprint came out of that particular book. If you took some of what Furman said on those tapes that surfaced during the trial, they are a direct parallel, essentially, to what was being talked about in those pages. So, in terms of a card-carrying a member of a group type of link, I don't have that sitting here. But in terms of a philosophy and a belief system, there's no question in my mind that there are direct parallels. And as you said, the difference that was pointed out to me is that in 1984, in the Berg book, you had authorities, police, FBI agents, etc., chasing these people down, rounding them up for trial. And in this particular case, I was told, they've moved in from the fringes into the system itself and can create a great deal of harm and disruption there with doing a very few things. So I think that, again, there are definite connections there.
We should note again that Newsweek did carry information taken from sources within LAPD personnel files alleging that Furman was involved with a group called White Anglo-Saxon Policemen, or WASP. I've never heard of any formal legal proceeding against Furman, so we should note that for formal legal purposes. However, those allegations reportedly coming from fellow officers were reported by Newsweek magazine. Now, Stephen Worth, in your book, or with regard to your book, I should say, Blood Oath, you also were contacted by an anonymous informant with information dramatically at variance with the Geraldo Rivera portrayal of the O.J. case, which sadly has become sort of the official disseminated version. And your anonymous informant also made some references to the order and to the murder of Alan Berg in connection with the O.J. Simpson case. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. On April 24th, 95, I was contacted by, and I don't have the knowledge of who it was where Stephen may have known this person before. This was out of the clear blue. Came forward based on the Oklahoma bombing, claiming that some of his friends were killed in there, and then he wanted to, come clean, so to speak. He wanted to clear his conscience. But in there, they talked about using the 10th anniversary of Alan Berg's murder or assassination as the kicking off point for the renewed effort to start a race war. This philosophy of one God, one race, one nation. He laid out in a very believable fashion exactly how they did it and why. Their intent, was to start a race war via a mechanism very similar to the helter-skelter Manson, who also was involved in trying to start a race war in August of '69. His intent was to blame the Black Panthers and have the Black Panthers murder the whites would murder the Black Panthers, and he would come out and do it. But that was the total philosophy behind his intent to start a race war.
By the way, we should note that the Manson family has been portrayed as a bunch of wayward hippies, so to speak. Many of the people actually involved with the Manson cult were affiliated with the Aryan Brotherhood, a Nazi prison gang that is quite powerful and that has connections with other white supremacist groups.
Yes.
Could you briefly outline for us, Stephen Worth, and again, both Stephen Singular's book, Legacy of Deception, and your book that you co-authored with Carl Jasper's Blood Oath, have been the subjects of past interviews that are available from Spitfire, a tape duplication service that stocks my work, and so listeners who are interested in a more detailed analysis of both Legacy of Deception and Blood Oath can obtain that from Spitfire. But could you briefly, and I realize this is a tall order, could you briefly sum up some of the major points of the O.J. Simpson conspiracy as outlined by your anonymous informant Skinner?
Well, yeah, it's Blood Oath, which is true. In the conspiracy to murder Nicole Brown Simpson reveals the motive for the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson. The vehicle is to frame a well-known black man for the vicious murder of a white woman. And this would create an environment for a race war, at least in their belief. Again, a carbon copy of the Sharon Tate LaBianca murders. But it lays out on October 9th, 1993, a meeting of what he called the Cause, Christian Aryan Underground Special Forces, that they held a meeting near Sandpoint, actually close to the Aryan Nation of Hayden Lake, where the plot was hatched, designed to create this atmosphere. It was all to coincide, or as closely as possible, with this 10th anniversary. They seem to have this belief that everything's got to be on some sort of anniversary. This came on the heels of, and a lot of people forget, in June of '93, there was an attempt, and this is what got me into it, to bomb and burn the AME First American Methodist Episcopal Church, slaughter its congregation, and target for assassination well-known Afro-Americans. This is, in fact, a copy of that is contained within the book, and also a copy of that was provided to me. That's as proof that this guy was involved. And, this was it was a note that was sent to me. All right. It lays out in there the how they did it. A special force group of with what we would call a unique strike team, a cell where they launched it near Barstow, California. All right, very close, the same railroad that Hyder, where that train wreck was, runs right through that area.
This, by the way, is an October 1995 derailing with the loss of life of an Amtrak train. Yet to be conclusively solved, a note was found at the scene attributing this to the, quote, sons of the Gestapo, unquote. And you mention a possible link with the OJ Simpson conspiracy in the postscript to your book.
That's correct. All right, anyhow, one of the things was that Skinner described Nicole as a traitor. She was German, who basically was, epitomized the white Aryan nation's beliefs. Blonde, blue-eyed, although she was bleached, blonde, blue-eyed, but she bore what they considered mud children, traitors, which is, to them, that was worse than anything. It was degrading the white group so that they felt it as a traitor, and they have a way of getting rid of traitors. Slitting their throats was a very common practice they talked about, which for some reason the LAPD never ever looked into. A group that would do something like this because it's a heinous crime. It took more than somebody really angry. It took someone with an intent to be extremely vicious, to get the ire of people up, which is exactly what was accomplished by this.
Stephen Singular, you noted, too, in your investigations of some of these same types of elements, the very strong emotions that ran in white supremacist and Nazi circles vis-a-vis, quote, race traitors, unquote.
Right. Well, that was one thing that was in the Turner Diaries, again, to go back to that. And I haven't read it for 12 years, probably, but I do recall them saying that race traitors would be dealt with, getting their heads cut off or their heads opened with axes and things like that. So it's, as Stephen is saying, that's a theme that runs through this. And it's specifically, in their eyes, there's nothing worse than you could do than being a white woman marrying a black man. So that fits right in with the theme.
You were talking, and in fact, you both made reference to the Turner Diaries in your books. This, of course, is a book written by William Luther Pierce, who's the head of the National Alliance, arguably the most important domestic Nazi group. They also have a publishing wing called National Vanguard Books, which publishes the Turner Diaries. They also publish a book called Hunter, about a Nazi assassin who goes around dispatching people of color and interracial couples. They also have another fascinating book called Serpent's Walk, which is about a Nazi takeover in the middle of the 21st century by the descendants of the SS, who infiltrate the U.S. military and who also put together a formidable financial underground and begin buying into the U.S. opinion-forming media in order to sway the American people to a Nazi viewpoint. Now, the Oklahoma City bombing was purportedly modeled, and we should bear in mind that neither Mr. Nichols nor Mr. McVeigh have yet to stand trial. The allegations brought by the prosecution maintain that the crime allegedly committed by those two was modeled after the bombing of FBI headquarters in the Turner Diaries, a bombing performed almost exactly as we are told, at least, that the Oklahoma City bombing was executed. You note in Legacy of Deception, Stephen, that as you were watching the proceedings in the O.J. Simpson case, that the only story which successfully pushed the story off of the front page was the Oklahoma City bombing. And then Stephen Worth, in your book, your anonymous informant maintains that the Oklahoma City bombing was actually pulled off by the same sorts of elements that allegedly killed Nicole and Ron.
Correct. And as a matter of fact, there's some information. One of the things that, just like Stephen Singular is doing, he's attempting to solve it on that end. We're attempting on this end. There's been some information that Strassmeyer, Andrew the Strassmeyer, issued a statement from Berlin through his attorney Kirk Lyons, who is the executive director of CAUSE.
We should bear in mind who, maybe fill the audience in who Andreas Strassmeyer is.
Well, he's you can probably do that a lot better than me, but he's an intriguing character that goes back to intelligence over in Germany.
Would you like me to sum up real briefly his
role?
Andreas Strassmeyer was one of the major security people at a white supremacist compound called Elohim City in Oklahoma, headed up by a fellow named Robert Millar. Several of the key people involved with Elohim City had previously been implicated in an alleged plot to blow up the Oklahoma City building. A fellow named James Ellison was associated with that alleged plot. Also, Dennis Mahone, a fellow whose name crops up in the context of your investigation and who had done white supremacist recruiting in LAPD. Strassmeyer admits to knowing Timothy McVeigh, although he says he was not involved in the bombing. He would not discuss details because he said, although he was not involved in the bombing, quote, running your mouth gets you into trouble, unquote. Timothy McVeigh called Elohim City a couple of weeks before the bombing, asked to speak with Andreas Strassmeyer. We should note that a white supremacist named Richard Snell was executed right around the time of the Oklahoma City bombing. He said to the judge, look over your shoulder, justice is coming. And a warning was issued by the militia of Montana indicating that if they don't do something on April 19th, Richard Snell will be executed. Robert Millar then went and claimed Richard Snell's body. Now, Strassmeyer, again, was a German military veteran. He was a German national, a veteran of the Bundeswehr, a former German army officer. He also is the son of Helmut Kohl's former chief of staff, Gunter Strassmeyer. So he's not a small-time individual. He has some fairly interesting connections. Again, I've detailed some of the evidentiary tributaries running between Oklahoma City and this compound, and also some of the same elements crop up in the context of the order and the investigation that Stephen Singular conducted in connection with his first book. So that's who Andreas Strassmeyer is. Go ahead.
Yeah, apparently there's documentation that he's actually spoke to McVeigh. There's also McVeigh is also involved with Aryan nations. There's been several publications that have come out about McVeigh's involvement now with the Aryan nations, and all these people seem to crisscross. You know, it's almost like a pattern. It's like you have a footstep here and there's another footstep, and they keep following each other around or talking to, but they never claim that they're working together. But what seems to be occurring now is nobody seems to take credit for the crimes anymore. Nobody came forward in the Oklahoma bombing. Nobody's coming forward in the church bombings or burnings. Nobody came forward in this TWA incident. Nobody came forward, at least in my belief, in the OJ Simpson.
Nobody's come forward, too, with the pipe bomb that went off at the Olympics.
That's right.
Although a white supremacist militia splinter group had been arrested purportedly for putting together pipe bombs to be used at the Olympics. We should note in passing that many people involved with the various militias are sincere patriots and fine and honorable people. There are also some explicit Nazi elements within some of those militias. So some people get bent out of shape at identifying the militias per se as a Nazi and white supremacist element. They're not. It's a diverse group, many of whom are sincere conservatives, although in many cases badly informed, but there are also some very well-documented and virulent, and in my opinion, in some quarters, underestimated Nazi elements within some of these militias.
Yeah, what appears to be the biggest problem is that the public at large, when you mention neo-Nazis, I mean, they've got a vision of, Hitler stomping down the street. They don't realize just to what extent they have infiltrated a lot of areas of the United States and what their aim is. On June 6th of 94, this is several days before these what we call assassinations, others call murders, etc. The Viper militia plan was put into force. That's a plan that was set all across the United States, and really it's a plan to take over the United States from the New World Order, as they characterize it.
This was June 6th of 94?
That's right.
50th anniversary of D-Day, we should note.
Yep, I've got a copy of it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of coincidences. Just like the first officer on to the scene was a fellow by the name of Richard Walley, W-A-L-L-E-Y. He's also one of the first officers at the Bianca murders and the Sharon Tate. I mean, it's coincidence, but it's like coincidence can happen, and people think that something. If you don't look at it in the right way, that case doesn't make any sense at all. If someone's got a cut on their left hand, that means that they had to commit the murder. But that's not always the case.
Van Adder also, by the way, was involved in the Manson investigation. A late colleague of mine named Mae Brussel alleged, and I suspect there's a lot to what she had to say, that there were not only Nazi connections, but perhaps even some intelligence connections to the whole Manson situation. We haven't got time to go into that, but we might want to bear that in mind, in the back of our minds as well. We mull over some of the overlaps between some of these investigations. Now, Stephen Singular, one of the problems that you had in attempting to communicate the information being communicated to you by your source, and one of the problems you had in dealing with the media, was similar to the problem Stephen Worth had. In other words, when you begin talking about Nazis, people basically rolled their eyes up. We're almost at the end of this half-hour side, but you encountered some of those same difficulties in your dealings, particularly with the media.
Yes, I just couldn't. Basically, I was dealing with white people, sort of middle class, I guess, white people, and what I was saying was just anathema to them. I contacted basically all the big time names: the New York Times, the LA Times, CBS, NBC, CNN, ABC, right down the line, and tried to get them either A, to listen to what I was saying, or B, to sort of enter into some investigative work with me, because I was sitting in Denver without a lot of resources, and they were sitting out in LA with a lot of resources. And basically, I couldn't get anywhere. I mean, it was astonishing to me the degree to which they simply could not receive any information that was new to them. I mean, their purpose was clearly to show I was wrong instead of just to listen to it and consider the possibility of looking into it. And this is after physical evidence began to surface confirming the things that I had been told, and some of those objects or some of the ideas were having an impact on the trial. So it wasn't simply some guy sitting in Denver floating theories. I mean, this was having some measure of impact. And then, as I was speaking with you earlier, when Christopher Darden, he himself wrote that a book proposal I wrote in 1994, late 1994, became the basis of the Simpson defense, or at least some basis of it. The information did have an impact. But to this day, no one in the conventional media has ever put that together. I mean, it's just a total brick wall. I mean, Geraldo Rivera will have on every lawyer with every almost inconceivable tangential connection to this case, but to actually bring on somebody who was involved in it directly, dealt with the lawyers, gave information to the prosecution, gave information to the defense, watched it surface during the trial, was in some sense perhaps even responsible for the FBI's involvement in the case. They don't want to talk about it. They do not want to deal with the evidence. I mean, Joe Bosco is now out there with his book called The Problem of Evidence, and he's doing, as Fried has pointed out, a wonderful service, because he's trying to focus these people onto the evidence. The only way we're ever going to get at the ultimate truth of this case, whatever it may be, is to first focus on the evidence so you can show what didn't happen. You have to get that out of the way first, and we haven't even gotten to that point yet, because you have to eliminate so much dross that is totally unnecessary. And if we could do that, then we could pursue these other things that Stephen Worth is talking about, or Donald Fried is talking about, or Joe Bosco is talking about, or I'm talking about, and do the work that has never been done in this case, which is basic, fundamental police legwork. And the really remarkable thing about the O.J. Simpson case is that we're all living, or most of us anyway, are living under the belief system of Mark Fuhrman. It has never changed to this day. It's the assumptions that he made in the first 30 minutes of this case that have controlled everything from the moment it began. When he rode over to that crime scene with Detective Phillips and laid out, and this is in the police records, it was in the trial, I know who O.J. Simpson is, I know what happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the mindset that we're all living under.
And we're going to discuss that in the second half of our interview. We've been speaking with Stephen Singular, the author of Legacy of Deception, and Stephen Worth, along with Carl Jaspers, the author of Blood Oath. We'll be joined by the two Stephens in the second half of our interview. My name's Dave Emory. Thanks for listening. Hello, my name's Dave Emory, and it's my privilege and pleasure to be joined once again by Stephen Singular, the author of Legacy of Deception, about the OJ Simpson case, published in softcover by Dove Books and copyrighted 1995. Also, we are being joined by Stephen Worth, who, along with Carl Jaspers, authored the book Blood Oath, about the conspiracy to murder Nicole Brown Simpson. That book also published in softcover by Rainbow Books, copyrighted 1996. Stephen Singular, Stephen Worth, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Thank you.
Just before the break, Stephen, you said something, Stephen Singular, I should say, you said something that I thought was very telling. You said that to date, we, all of us, meaning the American people, those of us who followed the O.J. Simpson case, have been living with the perceptions of Mark Fuhrman, who may or may not be formally allied with white supremacist groups. Those charges have been made, and there are some interesting things vis-a-vis his career in the LAPD that perhaps we can talk about. One of the difficulties that you've both had with your respective books, and we were talking about this shortly before the break, is the difficulty of getting people to deal with the idea that Nazis might actually be playing a role in our society, and that they may have played a role in the O.J. Simpson case, something that was presented somewhat obliquely to you, Stephen Singular, and something that was alleged in no uncertain terms to you, Stephen Worth. In both of your dealings with the media so far, you have been frustrated in attempts to get things across. Do you feel at this point that any inroads have been made at all, or do you feel that we're still sort of at square one?
Personally, and this is Stephen Worth, I think we're still at square one. You can see how Joe Bosco and Donald Freed are treated on the TV, on the shows. They're somewhat courteous, but they always seem to set them up with some opposing views real quick so that they jump all over them. Not the same thing like a Tubin or any of those who come up there with their ideas of what occurred at the scene. When they start talking about evidence, which is what the case should be about, and not about conjecture, they poo-poo everything. Biggest problem I had, I'm sure Stephen had the same thing, was trying to get this thing published, and published with some money behind it, so that people would see the book, would read about it, make up their minds. We had, there was Simon and Schuster, all of them. It's a great book. It's a great, but we won't publish because we think O.J. Simpson is guilty. We talked to, I don't know how many faxes and letters have been sent to Geraldo and Grodin, etc. They want no part of it. They're convinced that O.J. Simpson is guilty. And if you start to look at the evidence that's supposedly there, you see gaping holes. You see things that shouldn't be there. You see things that should be there. And when you start to talk about them, the media jumps right down your back. No, he's guilty. That just can't be the story. I turn that over to Stephen Singular and see what he has to say about that.
Steve Singular?
Well, it's literally true what he's saying, and if you watch the interviews that go on, and Larry King does a fairly good job, and he tries, and more than some others, but the moment you raise the issue of evidence, people deflect it, and I think it's because, not just perhaps that they believe he's guilty, but they don't know the evidence. And they're vulnerable, and on some level they must understand that. And you bring up some hard piece of evidence that somehow has never entered into the public consciousness, and they immediately knock it down. I mean, you just don't have an opportunity to go into it in any depth. Again, I raised several pieces of evidence in this book that have never been explained. A piece of stick that was found at the Rockingham estate that I was told was used to move the glove, that Marcia Clark brought into the courtroom and had Fuhrman unwrapped very dramatically on a Friday noon in front of the jury and never explained. What is it? Where did it come from? Was it tested for fingerprints? Is there blood on it? Why is this in the courtroom? We don't know today. I think we have a fairly good idea, but if you raise an issue like that in front of a person in the media, they simply won't deal with it, because any time this kind of hysteria runs rampant, it has to represent something else. And I think what it represents in this case is that people are much more comfortable with their assumptions and their projections than they are with the discovery of new information and new facts about our society. And I mean, the depths of this thing just continue to unfold for me. I think it goes into some basic well of racial, and I use the word racial. I'm not even sure it's racist. It's some racial thing that runs through our society, and people who have a lot of uncomfortable racial feelings suddenly have a chance sort of to toss them out there against a black person. And I really think it's that basic and that deep, and they don't want it messed with. And when you come along and say, but, you know, what about this? What about that? You're tampering with something that's very deep within the society, and it just shows you how difficult it is for people who are, you know, reasonably well educated and intelligent to have anything approaching an open mind. I mean, we're in some some corner of the American psyche that is very uncomfortable with itself, and that's what I just keep learning over and over again. And it's there at the New York Times, and it's there at the LA Times, and it's there a lot of other places. And it's an ingrained superficiality that does not want to look at what this case is all about, and it never has. And when you go up against it, you lose your innocence very, very quickly. There are contradictions here and problems with the evidence, and I've talked to the people in the district attorney's office who, in the first week of this case, went to the district attorney, went to Gil Garcetti, said exactly the same things I'm saying to you this afternoon, and were tossed out of the office, demoted, literally demoted from the position because they could not hear it. And until you get past that, we're just going to stay on the surface of everything. I mean, again, I don't mean to be repetitive, but how can you do a show on the OJ Simpson case every night, as Geraldo Rivera has done for 2 years and 4 months or whatever it is now, but not be willing to put on people with new information? I mean, it's an absolute travesty. I sit there and watch it. They will bring in Stan Goldman to analyze the same piece of non-information, and he's a bright man, and I'm not putting him down, but there's hard information there.
There's a dynamic that I discuss on my program that I think applies here. It's a dynamic of information versus confirmation. What you two gentlemen have come forward with is information, as well as Donald Freed and Mr. Bosco, information indicating that the pop/tabloid version of this event is dramatically different from what people are accustomed to thinking. We should also note that Stephen Singular's anonymous informant contacted him because of his previous work on the order in the murder of Alan Berg, and Stephen Worth's informant maintains that the O.J. Simpson case or the O.J. Simpson conspiracy, the conspiracy to murder Nicole, was actually executed on the 10th anniversary of the murder of Alan Berg and was intended to start a race war, that it was literally a Nazi psyop, so to speak, accomplished by people with experience in covert operations. But
David, it's interesting. Now, we both wrote different books at started at different times, one not knowing the other was involved in writing, but both have some of the same theme in there. But, going back to what Stephen said about, talking to people about evidence, and I'd supplied Blazer, who is currently the attorney of record that was on the criminal end there, with copies of photos that show footprints, that the FBI never analyzed, and started to look at the glove at Bundy, which is evidence item 37. That glove was only typed a typo by Matheson. It never went for DNA, which is kind of strange, because typo fits about 45% of the people of the United States. The hat underneath the bloody leaves has got no blood on it. There's the bottom of Ron Goldman's shoes or sneaker boots has a mixture of Nicole's blood and Ron Goldman's blood. Yet they say he was ferreted off to this corner back there. How in the world did her blood get there on the bottom of his shoes? If that's the case, it needed a minimum of 2 people to do it.
Now type O is not O.J. Simpson's type, correct?
No. Ron Goldman's a typo, but everything else went out for DNA. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think a lot of the defense attorneys realized that. I mean, I had to go through transcript after transcript to track down this glove. It never went out for DNA analysis. Now, the reason it becomes so important is around the picture, which is also a picture I don't think they ever saw. It happened to be in Darden's book, and I blew it up, to take a look at some of the things. There are these blood drops, but substantial blood drops over there. Now, somebody was bleeding right at the entrance to the gate. It's not Nicole's, because Nicole's got her feet stuck under the fence with no blood under it and blood all in front of her. So it's got to be the perpetrator or Ron Goldman, yet they never tested that blood. There are slide marks with his type of shoes right there with a heel print on top of it, yet the FBI never analyzed it. The only thing one can be led to believe is the only thing that the FBI got were these vertical photos right over a print, and that was all that was sent to the FBI. That's all they analyzed. The envelope, which had the glasses in it, has got a footprint you can see with the naked eye. Yet they said they couldn't find they saw parallel lines on it. Something's wrong with the way that evidence was presented.
One of the things that Stephen Singular was told by his source, and again we've alluded to this earlier, was that, quote, neo-Nazis are not just on the fringes of society anymore, but they're within the system and are doing a great deal of damage. Your informant, Skinner, also contends that the Cause group, this elite Nazi/white supremacist strike team that, according to your informant, actually executed Nicole, again for the purposes of starting a race war, polarizing race relations, discrediting law enforcement and the LAPD in particular, indicated that your source indicated that one of the key elements in this case in the operation was white supremacist/Nazi penetration of the police department.
Oh, that's correct. And not only in our bibliography in the book, and by the way, our book's one of the few books that's got an cross-index and a bibliography of newspaper articles. There are several articles and several excerpts where they talk about neo-Nazi groups, one called the Vikings in the Sheriff's Department, others within the LAPD, that there was one guy who was accessing computer files and giving it to neo-Nazi groups. Well, if he's given it to neo-Nazis group, he's probably a neo-Nazi. Now, in Cochran's book that was just out, for the first time, he says people inside of Mark Fuhrman's home had to come back with the feeling that he followed white supremacist beliefs. All right, that's the closest anybody has come out to making a statement.
A couple of things.
That's not exactly true. The LAPD investigation of Fuhrman itself. And you may be aware of this, but there was a 43-page investigation done of Fuhrman beginning in February of 1995, concluding in March of 1995. Now, as you'll recall, he took the stand in mid-March of 1995. So while they're preparing him to go to take the stand, the trial begins about the first week of February. The LAPD is conducting its own investigation of the people who came forward and said, well, first of all, he's a virulent racist. Second of all, he was apparently he was accused, and the evidence all points to the fact that he was putting these swastikas inside the locker of another LAPD officer, that he had a Nazi uniform and other paraphernalia. All of this is going on when Marcia Clark trots him into the courtroom as I say, in mid-March. The thing was, the investigation was concluded, I believe, about March 18th of 1995. I think he took the stand on the 14th, in which they're all avowing that, of course, they know nothing whatsoever about his racial beliefs. And as I said, it was a 43-page investigation with one allegation and one example of misconduct right after another. You get to the end of it, and the person in charge says, obviously, there's nothing to any of these allegations, and we, brush them aside.
The investigation...
But it's totally outrageous what people like Christopher Darden have talked about on television as recently as last week. Well, I didn't know what Mark Furman thought or believed. They knew absolutely everything about this guy. Forget the fact that it goes back 15 years into his psychiatric files. That investigation was going on simultaneously with this trial.
Even in Darden's own book, he talks about when he put his arm around Marsha Clark, Furman almost exploded. He made a comment to Marsha Clark about it.
Speaking of Marsha Clark, just one point I wanted to underscore here before we proceed. Stephen Singular, in your book, you discuss information about the investigation of Mark Furman's background, and indeed this was published on the front page of the Los Angeles Times, that an assistant district attorney, a woman named Lucien Coleman, had brought this information up to Marsha Clark, that the prosecution knew about this within a week of O.J. Simpson's arrest. And as I recall, in the investigation of the circumstances surrounding Detective Purdy's humiliation, he had married a Jewish woman,
right,
and then had swastikas painted on his locker. And as I recall, your relating of the investigation maintains that Furman's, according to the information developed, that Furman's fingerprints were found inside of Purdy's locker.
Right. That's exactly right.
And that's reinforced. Cochran says that also in his book. Not only that, he wears Nazi memorabilia underneath his lapel when his own superiors warned him against it.
Right.
This is in Cochran's book, which
this
I have
is in
not
Cochran's
read.
book now, yeah.
I have not read that. The point that I want to underscore is that Marsha Clark, one of Ms. Magazine's Women of the Year for 1995, knew about this information and also knew about allegations that Furman and Nicole were romantically linked.
Right.
Well, Joe Bosco said something. He was on with Donald Freed, and it was at the end of I think it was the Grodin show.
Right.
And just at the end, he said something to the effect that Mark Furman had been in Aspen with Nicole Brown Simpson. And it was at the end, and nobody said anything. It ended. I tried calling the Aspen Times, and there was no. They said they knew nothing about it, but something must have come up in Joe Bosco's research that links them a lot closer than people thought they were linked.
Well, the first piece of information I gave the defense team on August 8th of '94, the very first thing was Furman and Nicole knew one another. And of course, they threw up their hands and told me I was wrong. They did that no matter what I told them, and if you go back to the LAPD investigation, their own investigation, when Lucien Coleman and Julie Segosian and other people within the system, these are not defense lawyers, these are not reporters, these are not conspiracy theorists, these are people inside the district attorney's office were coming forward and saying, and police officers as well, coming forward and saying, Mark Furman has gone to numerous parties, he's talked about Nicole Simpson's breast implants, he's talked about other things, physical details about her, and these people made the leap that they were intimate. Now, I never put forward that contention. I don't know if it's true or false, but what I was told was that they knew one another, so this changed the entire environment of the investigation. That's why a murder investigation was never done.
By the way, you did point out in your book, Stephen, that in Mark Furman's testimony, I believe it was in the preliminary hearing, he did appear to have an unusual amount of knowledge concerning the custody status of Nicole and O.J.'s kids.
Right. He knew exactly what the custody arrangement was. Number one, he, in the middle of the night, of course, that night, he jumps in his car and drives over to O.J.'s, which I think is rather interesting. If you've ever made that drive, if you've ever tried to find the Simpson address in Brentwood, it's not that easy unless you know exactly what you're doing. And, of course, the other contention I put forward in the book is that he didn't make one trip over to Simpson's house that night with the other three police officers. He made at least two trips. one in the middle of the night, which has basically subsequently been confirmed from a number of different sources. And so, again, it's the background for the whole unfolding saga that followed that. Again, it's just astonishing that, 2 years and 4 months later, we, in the collective sense, know virtually nothing of what took place that night. We know nothing of what the police did with the evidence until it was all booked on June 16th. We know that now that, based upon the report of a man inside the crime lab, Gary Siglar, has now come forward in his deposition of May of this year and said, oh, by the way, Furman came in and got Nicole's blood vial and Ron's blood vial and checked them out.
Wasn't that Van Adder who he said?
I'm sorry, Van Adder, and had them, and they were booked, 3 days later. But apparently, from what I understand now, the judge isn't going to let that information in for either a legal technicality or I'm not entirely certain why. This is absolutely crucial information to what went on from the 13th, or really from when those men arrived on the crime scene on the early morning hours of the 13th until all of that evidence was booked in. Is it any coincidence that 3 of those officers, of the 4, are no longer working at the LAPD?
Stephen Worth, you mentioned in your book that this cause group, this Nazi white supremacist group, also with alleged foreign funding. It would appear to come perhaps from German Nazis from the context. But you mentioned that they had what they described as the Dark German, which was a code name for an officer or officers within the legal system who were sympathetic to and working with this particular operation. Also, a book, by the way, about Cato Kalin describes O.J. Simpson as having received threats from white supremacist groups, including those threats that were delivered by basically white supremacist members of the L.A. Law enforcement community. Apparently known even to the FBI. You mentioned that the framing of O.J., Stephen Worth that is, the framing of O.J. involved not only the Dark German, the code name for the officer or officers within the legal system, leading the investigation in a particular way. You also mentioned that the cause group themselves apparently had obtained some of O.J.'s clothing, again using intelligence methodology, and that they planted evidence, but that in turn they were also relying on LAPD to do some planting of evidence as well. One point that I would like the two of you to discuss, and that concerns the circumstances surrounding where the glove was found on O.J.'s place, because the informant that gave Stephen Singular his information described a plastic bag that has never been properly accounted for, and you, Stephen Worth, were told by your informant of a process called queuing. We have about 6 minutes left in this hour. Could you perhaps discuss the information given to each of you by your respective informants vis-a-vis the planting of the glove?
Sure, I'll go first with it. One of the things that always comes up in the theory of mafia, drugs, etc., somebody creating a frame, is that those thumps go unexplained in every theory. And it has to be somebody who's there around 10:40 to create the thumps. Because without the thumps, Mark Furman could have flew over the wall. He has no reason to go to the back. In what I was told, and I have to believe that some of the information I got was kind of tainted, that they wanted to cover up some of it. But anyhow, what occurred was they put the glove over there and then, using like a cue stick or a long pole or something, banged on the wall at around 10:40. The murder was still going on down at Bundy. They were using communications between the two sites. That's how that particular glove got there. Of course, it doesn't make any sense at all for O.J. to have gotten to the front gate, blood going through the front, through the Rockingham gate, and then come back out and then run across to the back of his neighbor's property, jump the fence, which is a security fence with pickets on it, these metal twisted pickets, and not leave any blood, hair, fiber, anything there, and come all the way up about a couple hundred feet. The one thing that we talk about in the book also is this episode with Mark Furman claiming he was at La Quinta, California at 8 o'clock on June 12th, and that he drove home and then went to sleep. That's that Sunday. Well, he said he left before the barbecue. We verified from 3 different sources there was no barbecue on June 12th. It was on June 11th on Saturday. I turned that over to the Criminal Investigation Bureau for the state of California. When I attempted to give it to the LAPD, they didn't want to hear about it. They said, is Mark Furman the murderer? I said, that's not up to me to find out. It's up to you guys to find out.
We should note again that you and your co-author suspected the possibility of some deliberate obfuscation on the part of your anonymous informant, Skinner. We'll note that in passing. Stephen Singular, your source gave you information about a blue plastic bag that was found just on the other side of that security fence, and in fact, your source turned out to be accurate, and then this appeared to be one of the other, investigative cul-de-sacs that you wound up finding yourself in.
Right. What I was told was that Furman did know Nicole, so that when he arrived at the murder scene at about 2 o'clock that morning with Detective Phillips, he already basically had in his mind what had gone on, that O.J. had killed these two people. And this is a scenario that was laid out to me that I basically just tried to investigate and get investigated. He went in, looked at the bodies, came to his conclusions, got in his car with at least one other person, and I do not have the identity of that person, drove over to Rockingham, looked for evidence, saw there was no evidence, saw there was nothing over there that was incriminating, came and that an argument ensued, basically, between him and whoever was with him, because they had essentially left the scene of a crime. They were the senior officers at that point. This is before Van Adder and Lang arrive on the scene. They had left the scene of a crime. They had come over there. They had found nothing. An argument had ensued. If you go back to Rosa Lopez's testimony, you will find that she talks about an argument at about 3 o'clock in the morning occurring on the property adjacent to hers, which is O.J. Simpson's property. Furthermore, if you read in Shapiro's book that a call was placed from Rockingham to the police station by officers at 2:53 in the morning. This is not information that was allowed into the trial, by the way. 2:53, a call is placed from Rockingham to the police station. So now you've got them physically located there. Furman's testimony in the trial is he went in, he looked at the bodies, and for 75 minutes he went out and stood in the middle of the street at Bundy and didn't do anything. That's what he said. Okay. What I was told is that he then comes back, he realizes he needs a piece of evidence that will be certainly create probable cause and allow the investigation to continue. He goes back inside, he breaks off a piece of stick from a fence, he picks up one of the gloves, he puts it in a blue plastic bag, it's on the record that they arrived there with a homicide kit containing these kinds of bags, puts the glove in the bag, conceals the glove on his person, takes the stick in the bag over to Rockingham, drops the glove, discards the stick in the bag, etc. The stick and the bag were subsequently retrieved. They were taken into custody with all the other retrieved evidence or possible evidence. They were presented at the trial. These things have never been explained. If you want to talk to Mark Furman this evening, I wish I could interview him. This is the first question I would ask him. If you want to talk to Christopher Darden, if you want to talk to any of these people in authority, focus in on this. What did that call represent at 2:53 in the morning? What does that stick represent? Go back to Cato Kalin's book and look at it right from the start. Marcia Clark grilled him about that stick because they couldn't figure out what it represented. I mean, it's a very long, complicated story. The reason she had Furman unwrap it in front of the jury is to deflect any further questions about it. And the defense team did a good job in some ways, but I don't think they went nearly far enough, and we may see more of this come out in the civil trial, although I don't know about that. But anyway, what I'm leaving out here is that before the glove is dropped on the ground, Furman, by his own testimony, is gone for 15 minutes alone behind that house. That's an incredibly long period of time for a small amount of space. In those 15 minutes, my information is he goes back to the Bronco, he opens the Bronco, he takes out the glove, he wipes it around, he picks up those red fibers. Those red fibers are crucial pieces of evidence in the trial because they surface on the glove. How did they get on the glove? Did O.J. drop it on the floor, then go and drop it on the ground? I mean, that's one possible scenario. What I was told was that he got into the Bronco, he wiped it across the floor, he picked up the fibers. Anybody who's ever written a book about a true crime situation will tell you that fibers are very crucial pieces of little evidence because they show that something had to be somewhere, whether on the bottom of a shoe, on a piece of clothing, or whatever. Cops know that. They understand that sort of thing very well. Then he goes and drops the glove. Then he comes back and tells the officers he found it. That's a scenario I was presented with. And if you read his testimony, his preliminary hearing testimony very clearly, he says right there, blood was in the Bronco, I-N. How does he possibly know that blood is inside that Bronco at 6 o'clock in the morning unless he's inside of it?
We are out of time. We should bear that in mind. Also bear in mind that Stephen Worth's source told him that it was elements of the cause group that planted the blood inside of the Bronco, which would not necessarily rule out Furman as the dark German, although there's no proof of that. We've been speaking with Stephen Singular, the author of Legacy of Deception, published in softcover by Dove Books, copyright 1995, and Stephen Worth, who, along with Carl Jaspard, authored the book Blood Oath about the conspiracy to murder Nicole Brown Simpson, that published in softcover by Rainbow Books and copyright 1996. Gentlemen, I want to thank you both for participating in this program. And for Stephen Singular and Stephen Worth, this is Dave Emory. Thanks for listening.